Gearing within self-managed superannuation funds, or SMSFs, has been a hot topic over the last couple of years. But before trustees undertake such a strategy, there are certain elements they need to be aware of. With me in the studio today is Andrew Biviano from Fiducian Portfolio Services to talk us through some of those elements. Welcome, Andrew.
Afternoon, Darren.
What are some of the things trustees need to take into account when using gearing in their SMSFs?
Gearing within self-managed superannuation funds, the key part from a trustee perspective would be considering how does that all fit in with the investment strategy of the fund, bearing in mind the sole purpose test, and some of the key considerations on why is this self-managed superannuation fund going down this line of gearing? Because gearing is just that, it's a strategy in which a fund can actually, or a fund trustee can use to actually help achieve their objectives.
And is liquidity an element that needs attention?
Liquidity is a big issue that they need to take on board. When you look at it from a perspective of you're using surplus funds that the fund currently has available to actually commit to some type of gearing strategy, you can see that when you start committing those funds, if that liquidity was to dry up, or that cash flow dries up, all of a sudden the whole strategy comes to a bit of an end from that perspective.
Has the global financial crisis made liquidity more difficult to manage?
I think it has, depending on the fund though, because different self-managed super funds have different underlying assets, and depending on what type of assets they were, will depend on whether or not the fund is actually going through any liquidity issue. Because when you think about from each of the funds, they have shares and, say, even the old mortgage-based funds, which provided a high level of income. With the global financial crisis, we've seen those yields drop in a lot of those cases. So potentially there are some funds that are experiencing a lower level of surplus cash flow. But from an other side of the equation, their expenses are changing slightly, such that let's assume the fund's gone into or paying out a benefit, and they were using some of these mortgage-based funds, which are now frozen, to actually help fund those pension payments. All of a sudden we have that situation where if they're no longer liquid, the fund may be struggling to meet those pension requirements. So yeah, definitely. So
interest rates, are they a challenge as well?
I believe so, yeah. Again, when we're going into the gearing side of the strategies, because we're using the surplus cash flow, and essentially the fund's expenses need to be paid, that being the interest cost as well. As interest rates start to rise, trustees are then going to need to give some consideration to saying, well, do we still have sufficient funds to actually maintain that borrowing?
So Andrew, how must gearing fit in with the overall objectives of an SMSF?
Part of the SMSF is to always have an investment strategy, which is part of the covenants from a trustee's perspective within SIS. So when you look at it from that perspective, gearing and the appropriateness of it needs to make sure it fits in with what the SMSF trustee is trying to achieve for the members, and i.e. being the self-managed superannuation fund members' retirement objectives.
And in terms of diversification of the fund, what are some of the things trustees need to look at?
Diversification, again, is one of those key areas that a trustee, when considering their investment strategy, needs to say, well, how is the assets of the self-managed superannuation fund being invested, and is the risk versus reward equation an appropriate mix? So therefore, not only bearing in mind the risk and reward being in line with the members, but also is it appropriate from a funding and cash flow perspective?
And finally, how important is it to have an exit strategy?
Exit strategies, from my perspective, should be something that are considered right up front, even before you go into gearing. An exit strategy helps the trustee and as well as the members from that perspective, because it's one and the same almost, in the same capacity, to actually understand how long they're going to be gearing for, what the objective's going to be, but also how they're going to close out the gearing strategy, because there is a borrowing component to it. So how are we going to extinguish the debt? Clearly, there are different ways of doing that. Some people choose to sell down assets. Others may not choose that option and may want to set aside other funds to help extinguish that debt, depending on what asset we're talking about.
Okay, thanks for your time today, Andrew.
Darren, thank you.